I'd just like to thank Congresswoman Maloney, who's joining us today, who's been a steadfast leader for our community and of course, has been really taking the charge in Washington, making sure the city is getting the relief that it needs. I'd also like to thank the Small Business Administration and, importantly, our partners at Community Board 3. Councilmember Rivera is also joining us on the call, and we thank her for her continued efforts and help here at the local level. I'd like to introduce Megan Joy. Those of you that don't know, Megan leads Community Board 3's Economic Development Committee and is really going to take a role in moderating this discussion, importantly, both with the Congresswoman and our colleagues at the Small Business Administration. Megan?
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate it. As well as chairing the Economic Development Committee on Community Board 3, I'm also a small business owner, so I've been in the trenches of these loans and trying to figuring it all out like the rest of you. I'd like to introduce Councilwoman Maloney. She represents the 12th District in New York's 12th District in the New York House of Representatives. She's chairwoman of the House Committee of Oversight and Reform, a senior member of the House's Financial Services Committee, and vice chair of the Joint Economic Committee. And we thank her very much for generously giving her time today. Thank you, Councilwoman. Thank you, Congresswoman.
I thank you, Tim, Lachlan, and the Lower East Side Partnership. This was a bill that I authored when I was a staff assistant in Albany to create these business improvement districts, and to see them serving the community and being so successful is a real joy in my heart. And I want to thank you, Megan Joy, for your leadership for the Economic Development Chair for that committee of Community Board 3, and for moderating the questions today. And also to Robert Piechota from the Small Business Administration for joining us to answer questions too. The Small Business Administration tells me that last year they processed over 60,000 applicants for small business loans, but they are overwhelmed this year. The program had $350 billion for this small business program, but already we are moving to expand it because of the demand that people are lined up and waiting. One bank in my district told me that in one day, they got over 112,000 applicants to get into this program across the country. So it has been a huge success. And we know that our small businesses are really the lifeblood of our city and our neighborhoods. They provide most of the jobs, most of the services. They exemplify the hardworking entrepreneurial spirit of our great city. And I am confident we will continue to face this crisis. On the line with me is Jake Friedman, who is with my office, and he can also be there to work with you for constituents, small businesses that are within the district that I represent. What is so good about the Paycheck Protection Act is if you follow all the rules, it's not a loan, it's a grant to help you get through this crisis. If you keep 75% of your 75% of the loan has to go to the people that are working with you, and the other 25% can go for utilities and rent and other expenses. I'm here to answer questions. I think most of you at this point know the outline of an eligibility of the loan, so I'm going to yield back and answer questions and listen and learn from this. We seem to be having one of these every single day, and it's important that we get the word out to our small businesses. It is a way we can help you open your doors quickly when this crisis is over.
Thanks, Congresswoman. So we have tons of pre-submitted questions that we want to get into, but before that, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. We hear that Congress is requesting an additional $250 billion because the PPP does not have enough funding. And then I've also heard that the Democrats might be holding this up because they want additional funding in addition to the $250 billion for cities, states, and hospitals. And then I'm hearing from Republicans that that money has already been funded and they want to wait to see that funding go through to assess any additional needs. What's the holdup, and where are we at in the process of that?
Well, these are always negotiations between the Republicans and the Democrats on the first CARES Act. The first proposal that was sent to us only covered helping corporations and bailing out some large employers and big businesses in our country, similar to the TARP Act that we had after the crisis in 2008. We wanted to expand it first and foremost for healthcare supplies, and we got hundreds of billions of dollars for our hospitals based on a formula that New York very much likes, that reimburses hospitals on the number of people they are treating for the coronavirus. And if you look at the country, the epicenter is right here in New York City. In fact, we put up 5 new hospitals in about 2 weeks to expand our number of beds from 50,000 to 90,000 beds. We also wanted an emphasis of getting money to individuals and to small businesses. And so we added the direct payment for those that have paid their taxes of a grant of $1,200, improved and expanded unemployment to cover more people. This is money going directly to people, and other things that we did to make that happen. And so that negotiation turned out well for our country, in my opinion. Right now, we have agreement on increasing this another $250 billion for the small business aspect of it. They are the major employer in my district and really in our country. And so we want to help them. Now, there's an agreement that we will come to that, but we are also hearing from our hospitals that they need more assistance and that they need more money for the personal protective equipment that has been so scarce. And so many health workers have become sick because they don't have it. That's unfair. That's like sending someone to the front line in a war without their military garments on them. So I think that my good friend that I work so closely with, Carolyn Rivera, and I are pushing to make sure that people get other resources too. The good news is that we will pass this $250 billion increase. We are hoping we can get other help. Our governor and our mayor are telling us that they have tremendous shortfalls in their budgets because of the coronavirus, billions and billions of dollars. They will have to start laying people off, people whose services we need in the city, and unless we get additional funding for them. So we are trying to push it and trying to get additional coverage, and that's what we've been doing.
Thank you. Before we start getting into the PPP and the EIDL, I just wanted to quickly touch base on business interruption insurance. Obviously we know that if insurance companies covered the business interruption insurance for every business that had to close, they would completely collapse. But if the government forces them to cover a percentage of that or some sort of smaller portion, is there any congressional action to, as a backstop, to allow this to happen?
Well, the Speaker Pelosi and the Democrats have asked me to write what we're calling PREA, the Pandemic Response Act for reinsurance for businesses during this. After 9/11, I wrote a bill that became one of the most important for the economy of our city called TRIA. It was the Anti-Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. It was incredibly difficult to pass. At the time, the Bush administration opposed it. We had to do study after study and work years to get it passed. And what it was is a federal backstop for an insurance in the event of another terrorist attack. Our insurance companies after 9/11 would not insure any business or anything. You could not insure a hot dog stand in New York. The only place insuring was a joint work between the McClellan Insurance Company and Lloyd's of London in London. That's the only way you could get insurance. It was through the roof. We finally passed the bill. It was successful. I'm proud to have led the reauthorization this year that passed early so that protection is there. The Pandemic Risk Insurance Act is now following the pattern of TRIA. I have a draft that we are circulating, and I can get you a copy of it, Megan, to look at and circulate to your businesses for their comments. It's a comment, it's a working document. but we are working and preparing for the future. As George Santayana, the philosopher, aptly said, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and we have to get ready for the next pandemic. So what I am working on now is, I would call it TRIA 2, only it's for reinsurance for disaster relief, and it's called the Pandemic Reinsurance
Okay,
Act.
so is that fair to say that this is something that not for this pandemic, but may be helpful for a future pandemic?
It would be helpful, definitely. It would cover future pandemics. I will tell you that many in the insurance industry are opposing it. They don't want this. They feel like whatever it is, it'll be too costly. But I feel that we have to pass something to plan for the future. That doesn't mean that there can be consideration for some type of coverage and help during this period.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. This next question, we're going to start going into the pre-submitted questions. And I'm not sure if the Congresswoman or maybe Rob want to speak to this. But the PPP, the deadline to use the forgivable portion of those funds is June 30th. And most people don't believe we'll be back to work. And we have 8 weeks to use those funds, correct? So the forgivable portion of those funds, which means we'd have to have our full payroll back by April 30th, which most people agree is not going to happen. Is it possible that they can move the June 30th deadline back to perhaps September 30th, so we have more time to use those funds? Because it seems like everyone's in agreement with the fact that we're not going to be back to work. And if we are back to work, it's going to be at half capacity, which means we'll probably need to use half of our staff. And then there's the question that a lot of our staff members are going to be making more on unemployment than actually coming back to work. So I think the PPP would be very useful if we could move that deadline to September 30th, or if we could be, or if we could be more flexible with the percentages. Perhaps we can use 50% for payroll and 50% for rent, especially in New York City, we have such high rents. So, I mean, if we can't do that, it seems like more of a loan geared towards getting people off of unemployment versus getting small businesses back up and running. Rob, maybe you could speak to that.
Well, thank you. First of all, for those who don't know me, I'm Rob Piechota. I'm the branch office manager for the SBA out on Long Island. Prior to this, though, I was the Small Business Development Center director in Brooklyn for 8 years. So I'm very familiar with who I'm speaking with now, and very sensitive to the plight of all business owners as well. But to your point about when must they use the PPP funds, let me talk about that in a second. Because there is the PPP is fairly new, there's a little bit of a lag finding lenders participating, getting them to accept applications in a timely fashion. And there's good reasons for all that. I'm not making excuses, but what can you do right now? Well, there is a program called the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, EIDL. We use a lot of acronyms, and you've all heard it so far today. I'll try to speak in the long version. But the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program has been available for about almost last month. And that's something you can apply for now, no matter what your circumstance. And people say, well, am I qualified? I'm telling you, I have 3 words to describe my attitude when it comes to the EIDL. The words are apply, apply, and apply. There is now a new feature, there's an advance, which is totally forgivable depending on the size of your organization, but it's worth applying, if not for no other reason, just for that. You could be turned down for the EIDL and still qualify for your advance, which may be a drop in the bucket for some, but it's something in the works while you turn your attention towards the PPP. Now, to be honest with you, I don't know exactly what the policy is going to be moving forward if the timeline is extended. All I can speak.
Rob, can I interrupt for just
Please.
1 second, ask a question about the
Yeah.
EIDL?
Yeah.
Most of the business owners I know applied for the EIDL weeks ago, and nobody's heard back anything. We got a confirmation number, and there's been no reply from SBA. There's talk about the $10,000 forgivable advance that was, supposed to hit the bank accounts in 3 days, and nobody's seen that. So there's been little, if no, communication from SBA on the EIDL.
And you're right. That is a common theme of what I'm hearing. Just bear in mind, and again, this is just the facts. This is the largest economic recovery event in our nation's history. And thanks to the good work of the Congresswoman and her colleagues, to include all concerned, it's moving forward. And really what we're facing right now with the PPP, it's really only been built in the last week or so. So not making excuses, but the EIDL advance is, all I can say is everything I've heard, people should be hearing very shortly. I can't put a time frame on. You're right. It was initially sort of advertised as within 3 days, boom, you're going to get it. Well, again, all 50 states have been declared a disaster area for this event.
Right.
And again, it's just an enormous burden, and they're doing the best. They're working around the clock, literally. But I do expect advances to be communicated and delivered in the very near future. But again, back to the PPP question originally, which I kind of sidestepped.
Yeah, sorry.
I can't tell you how quick you must expend those funds that you are granted under the PPP in order to get forgiveness. There is an 8-week marker right now, but if we can't open fast enough, I suspect the Congresswoman and her colleagues will create some kind of provision.
I hope so. Congresswoman, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, it's all under review. It's all new. The system is backed up like you couldn't believe. Everybody's telling me that they can't even get their PPP loan processed. We need more providers. We're reaching out to Quicken Loan and PayPal and some of these others to see if they can come and be part of the system to help get these loans out. They're so in demand. And we are reacting to a crisis, a great crisis. And first and foremost, it's the health and safety of our citizens and the health care. And we're struggling to get the personal protective equipment to our hospitals. We don't even have enough of that at this point. But we are looking to expand this program. I have heard what you said, really, Megan, from many of my small businesses. They're saying my biggest problem is my rent. Yeah. That's what I want to be able to cover. A lot of my people, I don't even know where they went. They already left. So that is a huge problem. And they are saying they want their rent, not 25% of it, but to be covered totally by it. So all of these things are under concerns right now, are being discussed, and they will be modified and changed. And we actually, the day that the PPP loan came out, they changed the guidance 3 times in one day. So they kept changing it in one day to adjust to the huge demand that was coming out there. So I personally have been advocating just for what you say, that half of it should be allowed for rent, and half for the employees. Certainly, if this continues longer than when we did it, we thought 2 months was a long time. Now people are telling us, it could be June. We just moved the Democratic convention from July to August. So that shows that those planners think it's going to be going through August. And now we're looking at having a tele-convention because we don't even think we'll be able to get together then. So a lot of it, first and foremost, it's got to be health. What are the guidelines that our health professionals are telling us we have to follow to keep ourselves and our neighbors and friends safe? And if they say it's going to be 5 months or whatever it's going to be, then we've got to extend the loan for that. That's the bottom line. And I think the fact that we are moving so quickly, we tried to pass this on Friday, today, but to show that we're moving so quickly shows, that we understand, crisis that we are in financially and the need that we have to put out there to keep our small businesses afloat. So at like a lot of politics, it's sort of like mercury in your hand, it's moving around. And certainly this program is moving around because it has been so successful. And I do compliment Secretary Mnuchin, who was in charge really at the final say on what we move and do with this program. And I would suggest, along with your elected officials, the community board, get not only to the SBA, but to him, the changes that you want. I will certainly relay them myself, and I support them.
Right, because I mean, I think as business owners, we know realistically when we reopen, it will be reopening probably at half capacity, and we'll be reopening in the middle of a great recession. So it doesn't really make sense to bring back our full payroll. It makes more sense to bring back maybe half of our staff, and then let the other half claim unemployment insurance for the remaining weeks, and then we could come back strong and start working. But to go back at full capacity, I think is unrealistic. So I would advocate for 50% for payroll, 50% for rent, and a deadline of September 30th. Just talking about rent a little bit. When it comes to, we're hearing a lot back from landlords now as we're writing these emails saying that we can't make rent, and some are being reasonable and some are not. Is there anything we can do? Is there anything Congress can do to support landlords to make those so that when we go negotiate with them for rent abatements and the landlords can't make their mortgage payments, is there anything that we could give support to the landlords? And this might mean more of a Councilwoman Rivera question, to support them so that make our negotiations a little bit easier with them.
Well, the federal government plays a role through Fannie and Freddie financial assistance to mortgages, and when this came on, I wrote a letter that those that have federally backed mortgages, that they not be, that they be given forbearance, that it be forgiven during this period. And within almost a day, the federal government got back to me and said that they would do that. So in terms, if you have if your landlord has a Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae mortgage, they are forgiven from the federal government. But a lot of our rent laws are written and put into place on our local and state level. And right now that there are bills in the state legislature for forgiveness of rent. And I think that, and I support the state efforts in that area, but Carolina also can talk about the city and what they're doing. They have several programs to help in this area. So I'd like to refer to Carolina Rivera on this question too.
Sure. So, when it comes to the state, I think we saw that there wasn't a ton of direct assistance in the budget that was passed. And so I know that the city really is going to have to step up in this capacity. The small business services loans and grants that were opened, as you know, that deadline closed. And so there was this wider kind of scramble for SBA. And I want to just thank the Congresswoman, her, and as well as Nydia Velasquez for directly calling banks and making sure that they broadened their customer base to not discount or not include people who were eligible to apply. So thank you. When it came to Citibank, when it came to Bank of America, they were absolutely instrumental in making sure that we got to where we needed to be. So as we're looking at negotiating the budget, what I would say is, one is our office is always open to help people kind of navigate the process, to answer questions. We have, great relationships with all of our colleagues on every level. But I think we do have a real obligation to try to figure out some sort of small business component. I mean, I've said a couple times that we're hoping maybe a public bonds program could potentially work in order to bring money into our communities. However, this is a very different economy post 9/11. And it is not the same. It's just not the same considering the global, the international impact that this crisis so many people. So we're looking at different options. I know that for me, it's always about the workers and the families, and then making sure we're taking care of the very basics. So we had a 3.5-hour budget negotiations team meeting on Monday to look at the forecast economically, and it is bleak. I think the federal intervention and this next wave of money is going to kind of dictate what we can do as a council, and then of course using the help of all of you on this call to try to put together a program. It might not be what everyone is expecting because of our limitations in jurisdiction, but it'll certainly be something that's tailored to what we're hearing and seeing out on the ground, thanks to you all.
Just a couple more things on rent. I know I'm hearing from a lot of electeds that, worst case scenario is some businesses close down for good. And I just want to let you know, as somebody who holds a few leases in this city, that's not the worst case scenario for us. There's actually a lot of people who handing back the keys and walking away would be a luxury. The truth of the matter is that most of us have personal guarantees on these leases, and it's almost impossible to walk away. Even if you have a good guy agreement, there's very, very expensive clauses to that agreement. And depending on how much the landlords want to play hardball, is there anything the government can do to help protect tenants from, being bled dry or losing their homes because of these personal guarantees on their leases and the fact that they won't be able to pay rent for a few months? Follow up to that, maybe this is an option, maybe it's not, but I mean, effectively, these landlords are sitting on 2 to 3 months worth of our rent as it is in the form of security deposits on the leases. What's stopping the landlords from using that money? It's already there.
Well, I think that's a good city and state policy. I'm a federal legislator, so I've got my hands full with the federal efforts. I would support a program such as you described on the state and city level. But this is really landlord-tenant law is really state law and city council, city law. So I support their efforts. I did what we could do on the federal. We do federally guarantee loans, and in those areas, they put a freeze on them. They're no longer foreclosing. They're not acting. So federally, what we could do, I've already accomplished that. So this is something that has to be done on the local level. I suppose federal legislation could support putting money into these types of programs. But right now, our priority first is the individual health, the hospitals, the healthcare workers, and then businesses in the country, to keep them still propelling forward in the economy. But this is something that is a state issue, and I support the efforts of our legislators. There's a number of bills on the state level that would address
Congresswoman, actually, I just wanted to thank Senator Hoylman for being on the call. To join us in a video moment, hop off just from a state perspective, and also just to thank our partners at the Cooper Square Committee, and importantly, co-sponsors of this event, the East Village Independent Merchant Association and Jimmy Carbone, who's joining us. But I'm going to hop off to get us Senator Hoylman while Megan continues with our.
Thanks, Tim. Hopefully Senator Hoylman can speak to the rent issue in a bit. In the meantime, I'm going to go into some questions, a little bit more detailed questions that were submitted to us. There's been a lot of questions about Rob, this one's directed to you, about sole proprietors and single member LLCs. How do they calculate their monthly payroll? And when can they apply? There's been some rumors that they could only apply as of today, the 10th, whereas the program went live on the 3rd.
Well, it's a great question. Thank you. So today was the window where for the Paycheck Protection Program, today opened the opportunity for independent contractors and self-employed to apply. Again, this PPP is through the lender. So, and I've had people try to bring me their applications or send it to the SBA. That's the last thing you want to do. You want to go ideally start with your lender. And if they are approved by the SBA, that's where you want to start. I know there's been a number of questions on the chat. and there's a number of questions across the past week or so where, what if the lender doesn't take my request, or I don't have an account with them, or I have a personal account but I don't have a business account? The answer is you don't have to go to your lender. You can go to any approved SBA lender, and they're getting more and more coming all the time online. But I'm going to read to you something as far as how do you compute your compensation in order to come up with a baseline for the loan. I'm going to read to you. I don't want to miss the wording. This is off of the 2483, which is the SBA form you'll find on Department of Treasury or on the SBA site. But again, the lender will give this form to you, but just for planning purposes, one of the best sources of how do I compute compensation is right on here. And with respect to the purpose of the loan, payroll cost consists of compensation to employees whose principal place of residence is the United States in the form of salary, wages, commissions, or similar compensation. In other words, cash tips or the equivalent based on the employer records of past tips, or in the absence of such records, a reasonable, good faith employer estimate of such tips. Payment for vacation, parental, family, medical, or sick leave, allowance for separation or dismissal, payment for the provision of employee benefits consisting of group health coverage, including insurance premiums, retirement, payment of state. Anyway, you get the drift here. This, no one's going to remember what I said, but this is on the form. The lender will be able to coach you through this. Bottom line is you're going from last year's average monthly payroll. When it comes to the cash compensation, everybody must be capped at $100,000. So if you have a couple of high liars in there where maybe the owner, where they're making above that, for purposes of computing this, everybody gets capped at $100,000. On top of that, you put in all the benefits, such as I mentioned. The only thing you don't factor in, state and local taxes go in there. Employer pays state and local taxes, but you can, of course, add FICA into that. You figure all that out, you come up with a monthly average, and that's where you multiply 2.5 times, and that is a number that you can get a loan for. So obviously, the smaller you are, the smaller the loan is going to be. And that's the number you're working with. Again, if you make a mistake, it's going to be a discussion between you and the lender. You want to have your information available. If you ask for more money and somehow you get it, and you don't have these records to show this is where I came up with these numbers, this is my payroll data, then you run a risk of it not being forgiven. The Congresswoman mentioned earlier, this is really almost a possible grant because it's a pass-through to get your employees back on the job. 75% of your loan must go towards restoring your employment to the baseline level. I think you can drop like 25% below that, and no employee under $100,000 can have their wages dropped more than 25%. I know that's an earful and it's a lot to fathom, but it's documented on the website, so you can walk through this. But just hear me out. If you factor that all in, everything works, you apply all the money appropriately, 75% of that loan, 25% can be utilized for other allowable expenses, utilities, some mortgage interest. You could actually, if you have the records, if you take out an economic injury disaster loan and you have, let's say, other than your advance, you have to pay off. By the way, the EIDL interest rate is 3.75. So if you have money left over, you owe one for the EIDL, you can use the PPP 25% that's left over to pay down your EIDL. So I know it's a lot to think about and it's probably escaping a lot of folks, but I want to make one important plug right here. If you go to any one of our resource partners all throughout the city, there's 24 in the state, but in the city alone, there's 8 different small business development centers. They're all working remotely because of what's going on. You can go to the website. I'll give it to you in a second, and I'll follow up with Lower East Side Development folks after this. But the point is, get an advisor signed up. Go on the web and get an advisor assigned to you. There's one at Pace. There's one at Baruch. There's 2 in Queens. There's 1 in Brooklyn. Anyway, the point is, you want an advisor working for you to help you put together some of the data and apply for these things, as well as women's business centers. SCORE has a chapter in the city. So all these are available. SBS, they're waiting to help you. SBS is a phenomenal opportunity. And all you need is just somebody to coach you, to help you put together the right documentation. So I probably covered a lot of things I didn't ask, and I apologize, but I'm excited about people thinking, okay, PP is good to get payroll going and people back to work early. Barry, your comment about what happens if we go longer, but also think about the EIDL to help you bridge the gap.
I also wanted to welcome Senator Brad Hoylman, who just joined our call. And I'm not sure, Senator, if you heard my questions regarding rent and the personal guarantees we have on the leases and, you know, the restrictive good guy guarantees, and also the possibility of that the landlords already have 2 to 3 months of our rent in the form of security deposits, and the possibility of those being used. I don't know if you could speak to that, please.
Well, let me just first thank Congresswoman Maloney for her historic support of small businesses and consumers and everything else that, especially during these dire circumstances, her leadership has really raised the standard that we all need to meet. And I know she's trying to do that, convincing her colleagues down in Washington. And of course, Carolina Rivera has been, you know, leading at the local level. And I'm very proud to work with her and helping so many constituents during this very difficult time. So to both of them. In terms of the rent issue, you're right. There is a call right now that the governor could, through his executive powers, make it such that security deposits would be applied toward future rent payments. And I think it's something that advocates, are requesting the governor do, but I think it's something that small businesses and small business associations like yourself should also be asking the governor to do. The problem with a lot of the proposals that we have, one of them is a cancel rent proposal, like you suggest, that would allow, under the terms, we would be suspending rent for 90 days under legislation that's being proposed. It's S8125A. It would institute a 90-day rent suspension for small businesses that close as a result of COVID-19. But that bill, has to pass. And we haven't yet reconvened in Albany after we just passed the budget a week ago. So I'm hopeful that we reconvene. But in the meantime, I think you should be supporting that cancel rent initiative because it applies to landlords too, and small businesses. Under the terms of it, landlords who lose rental income would be entitled to have their mortgage payments waived. And then there's another bill that pairs rent suspension with the creation of a fund for landlords who lose rental income as a result of rent suspension. So,
Senator, how do we support those? How do we support those?
I would do two things. I would certainly make your voice known to your local legislators, i.e. Harvey and me, among others, but also contact the governor's office. Write the governor and urge that he issue an executive order in connection with these proposals, as well as ask him to support this legislation. That'll be very powerful coming from small business owners and associations.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, some more questions coming in about the PPP. In response to the PPP not being able to be used for rent unless based on payroll, does the EIDL cover rent only? The EIDL does not cover rent only, but maybe you could speak to what it does cover, Rob.
Well, I'd like everybody to think about the EIDL. Again, EIDL is economic injury disaster loan. So I'm hoping people can think of like working capital replacement. So the key thing is EIDL makes a lot of sense for those kind of things. Rent, accounts payable, fixed debts that are nipping at people's heels, even though they're closed, they can't pay, or any bill that they cannot pay because of the situation. The revenues, it's not to replace lost revenue. Neither of these programs replace lost revenue, unfortunately. The PPP, let me just remind, if you allocate 75% of whatever your proceeds are towards your payroll and restore your baseline headcount and salary level, then 25% of your PPP could go to things like rent. So that rent is one of the rent, utilities, mortgage interest, et cetera. So it's a little bit of flexibility, but key with all of that, with PPP, you just got to have really good records. And by the way, with the PPP, if you want total forgiveness on everything we talked about, you've got to ask for it. So once you get your money, whatever that may be, and you're allocating, you do everything right, and you have great documentation, you need to be mindful. You have to request from your lender in writing you want to be forgiven and be able to produce the documentation to support your claim. A reminder, the PPP is a 1% interest loan. So if you don't get forgiveness, it's 1% on the outstanding balance, and that is a 2-year term. So, and by the way, there is a deferment with a PPP. There's a 6-month deferment from the moment you get it dispersed. 6 months later, that's when you must make your first payment. Interest does accrue in the background. Going back to the EIDL for a second, the term of the EIDL program is 30 years. And I mention that with emphasis because it was designed that way so that people, again, nobody wants a loan. But if you factor out 30 years, it makes your payment, your debt service manageable until the wheels start turning again and you can resume business the way it was supposed to be.
So about the EIDL, a lot of us realize that the 25% that we can allocate towards rent and utilities in the PPP, for most New York City tenants, that's a drop in a bucket for what we owe or what we will owe in rent. It might cover a half to 3/4 of 1 month's rent. So the plan was to apply for that and also apply for the EIDL. Now, what I've heard from the EIDL, the initial cap was 10 million, and then it got brought back down to 2 million recently. And now I've heard from some people, now this may be rumor, but that they're capping it at 15,000. So it seems like the EIDL is dwindling. Is there any truth to that?
I've heard the rumors. I cannot substantiate that. The loan amount, the max for the EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan, again, that's based on how big of an organization you have. The cap for that is $2 million. The PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, max for that is $10 million. As far as the EIDL being capped at 15,000, I have not heard that. I mean, I've heard the rumor, but there's no substantiation. I really can't comment on that.
Okay. If you haven't, people are saying, if you haven't gotten an EIDL confirmation, I'm assuming that means confirmation number, should you reapply?
I saw that in the chat. So if you have not received a confirmation number or you don't know what it is, I would reapply. If you did it correctly the first time, but you don't have the control number, you're not going to lose your place online. But again, if you are reapplying, please check the box where it says you want the advance, because that is forgivable, totally. But I do know there's a major backlog and it's a major concern where I haven't been contacted yet. From my understanding, it's probably in excess of 10 days before you even get an email. I do recommend to people, just to be safe, always check your spam folder and your junk mail folder, because it could get hung up in there. But all I can tell you is the advances, if you applied like a week ago, the advances are imminent. And it's once it starts rolling, it'll flow. But I wish I had a better answer for you.
Well, I know when I applied for the EIDLs, I immediately got a confirmation number. That was 3 weeks ago, but we haven't had any word back from them since. But there was an immediate confirmation number. So if you haven't received that, I would also recommend
when you applied,
reapplying.
When you applied, did you check you wanted the advance?
Of course I did. Who wouldn't?
And
Do you want a free $10,000? But I mean, I think we should note that if you all pay that $10,000 comes off the forgivable portion of your PPP. So it's not an additional free $10,000.
And by the way, I want to stress it's up to $10,000 advance. I want to be clear because people probably like there's stars in their eyes, like we don't want that. It's going to depend on how large of an organization you have. And I can't tell you what the algorithm is, but I don't want people to feel like what happened when if they got a $5,000 check.
Right. If an applicant has received an SBA economic, during the application process for the PPP, it asks, has the applicant received an SBA economic injury disaster loan? And since it seems like nobody has yet, should they be answering yes or no, even if they've applied?
No,
So
you have no idea. I mean, you can establish a dialogue with your lender. So when you answer the question that day, you put down what's true that day.
okay, great. Carlina, I wanted to direct this to you. Banks seem to be making their own stipulations on who they're accepting applications from for the PPP. They're saying only if you have an account with us, or some I've heard only if they've had existing debt with that particular bank. Neither of these are stipulations from the SBA. Why do the banks get to make their own rules, and who's stopping them?
You know, this is what I mentioned earlier, that we actually called on our Congresswoman to really intervene with some of the banks who were taking, I think, autonomy to a level that was clearly a disservice to all the small businesses there. So if there are problems with certain banks, what happened with Bank of America and the intervention by one of our Congresswomen, it changed almost in 24 hours those eligibility requirements that they were putting forward. I have a problem putting this much power in the hands of banks just generally, because historically they just haven't been good to communities, whether they're Black and brown communities, women-owned businesses, redlining, and that whole history. But if there are issues with certain banks, we have really cultivated relationships as time has gone on. And along with our federal and state partners, we can try to reach out to them and make sure that they are really opening that base up to you all. I have a small business owner in my own home, and not only has it been difficult to navigate what they consider the criteria, it's also it also takes you hours and hours and hours. And so I just want to thank you all for your patience. Anything we can do, please let us know.
Yeah, because like Chase was about 4 days late on getting their application online live, and then once they finally did, it went down within about 12 to 15 hours, and nobody's been able to apply yet. So, I mean, it's great that we're making this funding available, but we have to be able to apply to get the money. And that's been a challenge for small business owners.
Some of the banks have been changing the criteria. They've said, that you can't apply if you don't have an account with us, or your loan request has to be over a certain amount of money. None of that was part of the legislation. So we've been pointing out to them that that's not the legislation. If you are an FDIC insured bank and an SBA lender, then you must process this paperwork, and you can't say that the loan has to be over a certain amount. You're supposed to do it for everyone. And it's very important that we open the doors for women and for minorities. I've been pushing that they really keep tabs on how many of these loans and forgiveness are going to women and minorities and our whole community, not just a small segment of it, and not just large loans. A small loan to a smaller employer is just as important as a big loan to a big employer, and they have to both be honored. And we had a conference call on that with the whole caucus, that these banks can't write their own criteria. The criteria was written in the legislation.
Thank you. Congresswoman, I was
just going to say, someone in the chat said you should look into Chase. And so I think it really does depend on your experience, because I got complaints about the city as well. So I think it really depends on your experience. And I think maybe long-term we'll work with our federal representation to figure out another pandemic or some sort of disaster, that those guidelines aren't so flexible.
Right.
Well, they're not flexible. They're just making their own rules, and they shouldn't be. And the easiest way to look at how someone's going to respond is look at the history. And I looked at the history of lending in New York. The number one loans are Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Chase, but in that order of the amount of loans that they put out. But what has clearly happened, and I think the SBA representative can augment this, it's an historic ramifications, this loan. Last year, the SBA all year long took in 60,000 loans, processed 60,000. One bank told me one day the applications were over 112,000 in one bank alone. So what we are looking at is expanding portals that people can get these loans from into your community banks. If your community bank's an SBI lender and an SBA lender, you can go to a community bank. And we're also looking to expand it to other types of lenders like Quicken and PayPal and others, because the demand is just historically high. We've never seen anything like this, and the system has been breaking down. So we have to make adjustments, and we have to get more money into it, and we have to extend the program, as was pointed out by all of you.
Congresswoman, we just have a couple of minutes before we start to close out. I wanted to ask you if there's been any conversations yet about the back to work process, whether, if there's a timeline for it, or whether it's going to be partial capacity, or if there's going to be antibody testing before people are able to return to work. Is there any conversations starting that yet, or are we is that too quick?
Well, I think we need to test everyone, and the countries that have come back are those that have tested everyone. South Korea, only 2% of their population was not tested. We're not there yet. We don't have the tests out, but if you could test, then you could see who could work and who couldn't, and it'll come to the point that you may even be tested before you walk into the door someplace. But right now, we are just moving forward with the disaster and trying to figure out what's going to happen. At first, we had an extension to April 20th. Now it's been extended to April 27th here in New York, the lockdown. And if we still have as many deaths and people becoming infected, then it will be extended even longer. So it depends on how and we are all part of the solution. We are all part of stopping the spread of the virus, of wearing our masks, of really quarantining ourselves and making sure that we're not infecting anyone, because you can be infected with the disease and not even know it. So we're all quarantined, trying to keep a plateau. The governor said today in his press conference that we had a plateau today. Let's see if it continues. If it doesn't continue, then we're in for a longer run. A lot of it depends on the virus and the potency of it. And our number one goal, of course, is to protect our people, support our hospitals, our medical workers, those that are on the front line combating this disease. But we have to also control the testing, which we have not been able to do. We had a very, very slow start in testing. We are testing thousands now in New York, but it's not enough. We need to test all of our citizens, and we don't even have the tests to do that. Right now, the protocol coming from HHC is that you have to have all three of the variables of the disease. You have to have the cough, the throat, and the loss of breath, almost gasping, needing a ventilator before they'll even let you into a hospital now. So we have no real understanding of the numbers, because they're telling everyone to stay home unless you feel you're dying. So it's really a dire case. So no one has the answer. It depends on how we collectively can work to combat this disease, and what we can take the responsibility to make sure that we are not infecting anyone else, that we are wearing our protective gear, that we are 6 feet apart from any other individual, and just battle this virus together. We're all, in a way, it has united us like I've never seen us so united. My favorite part of the day is at 7 o'clock when we all hang out the windows clapping for our first responders, our nurses and our doctors that are out there fighting for us. And I've never seen the city more united and determined. And everyone I see in my neighborhood, we're all following the protocol. We're all seriously staying 6 feet away from each other, and that should start bringing the infection number down. But if we don't, if we continue to mingle, then it will spread more and more and more. So the answer is how we fight it by following the protocol. Obviously, many people feel it's going to be until August because major events are being canceled in August and maybe beyond. So we are in the hardest fight I've seen in my job. I keep waiting for the job to get easier. It keeps getting harder and harder. I thought after 9/11, nothing could be so terrible. Then came Sandy, which was horrible to certain parts of our city. And then the economic failure that hurt so many people. We lost zillions, trillions of dollars in economic wealth and jobs and homes and tremendous grief for families. So, and this one is just unbelievable. Every time I call a friend, they're in the hospital. It's, a lot of my friends are community leaders, so they're interacting with people. And the number of friends that are in the hospital now or have passed are just heartbreaking.
Yeah, I had an employee of mine pass away from the illness, so I hear you.
Yeah.
Very quickly, Senator Hoylman, there's been still a lot of issues with the unemployment, people applying for unemployment. The number one being, it seems to randomly ask some people to follow up by phone, and it's impossible to get through by phone. Has there been any improvements on that end? Oh, we can't hear you.
Can you? Oh, I'm sorry. I'll unmute. Sorry.
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay. They've rolled out a new system where you apply online and then you should receive a phone call back. They say within 24 hours you should get a call returned. They've added hundreds of staff to the Department of Labor helpline on unemployment insurance. So I'd be interested to know from constituents if the system is working better. We've obviously been letting the governor's office know that it's not sufficient. It's the number one constituent request that we get is assistance for unemployment. And, as the Congresswoman knows, we're going to see, upwards of 15% unemployment by the end of the month. It is a huge economic hit, but we have to help individuals manage this system. So we're trying to do that. Also on a case-by-case basis, not just knowing how the system is going generally, but if people want specific assistance, they should reach out to my office. Carolyn Wexelbaum is on this call too.
Thank you. Do you want to say a few thoughts to wrap things up for us?
Sure. I just wanted to thank everyone, right? SBA, SBS, Congresswoman Maloney, Senator Hoylman. Big thank you to Jimmy Carbone and our friends at Avima, who has put on a couple of these so far. I mean, what we're hearing today for the past week is that small businesses need more support. We do want more federal intervention. The pot is just not going to be big enough, and programs aren't covering everything that you typically spend on. And we know that. So there's still a lot more that we have to do for small businesses, because you are going to be the ones that help us our recovery economically. I think even Republicans like Mitch McConnell and they believe that more small business relief needs have to be our priority. So there is this bipartisan thought that we have to support you all. It's just the political will to do the right thing and to get money directly into your pockets and into the workers' pockets. That's something that we have to continue to fight for. I think the banks right now are probably one of our biggest issues. As the Congresswoman said, the rules are pretty set, though it seems like they're taking a few liberties that aren't necessarily, we're not really able to navigate, and we need to hold them accountable. So I'll be there every step of the way with you all. I think big businesses have had 10 great years right now. And they need to step up and contribute a little in government revenue due to bad tax policy. So, I'm going to try to do what I can to expand city programs. And I know the state budget wasn't necessarily helpful. Sorry, Brad. But he realizes that we can all do something on the local level to make sure that you feel like you're being heard. So thanks everyone for their honesty in the chat. and for some of the issues that they're going through. And together we'll all be working with you to really try to make it through this hole.
Thanks. And I just wanted to thank Rob Piechota from SBA, Councilwoman Rivera, Senator Brad Hoylman, and Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, as well as our partners at Avima and the Lower East Side Partnership. Just disseminating all the information that's coming down small and business owners has been a huge help for us, and these webinars have been a huge help, so we really appreciate the time.
We thank you. We
Thanks,
thank
Megan.
you.
You're the best.
All right, thanks, guys.
Happy holiday, folks.